Since the turn of the present century, the old global order is under stress because of the rise of China in East Asia, and China actually threatens the established global order, and also has, there's a view that the US power is in decline. And what is emerging is a very interesting power play between the big emerging powers. And the present century, therefore, seems to be characterized by multiple and competing sources of global power. As China, India, Russia, Japan, and other nations gain strength across various dimensions of power, be it political, be it military, economic, and cultural, shifting patterns of major power dynamics have become more critical to the future of the international system. So the question arises, will the relative decline of the US and the rise of the rest lead to the decaying of this established global order? While American decline has often been exaggerated, the fate of the rising powers is far from certain. And therefore, what this gives rise is to a new great game, which is being played out in Asia, but has ramifications for the global world order. And also, these Asian powers are actually fighting for global influence. While there are plenty of predictions of other great powers rising, there are none that suggest the US will collapse. I do not, for one, subscribe to the theory that the US is going to collapse or is in decline or is going to cede strategic space anytime soon. So what we are basically witnessing is that there is a change in the balancing power, and the new powers are only bringing in a bit of a churn in the established global norm, and America's role as a balancer and as a conciliator will continue to remain indispensable in this evolving strategic environment. In Asia, it is China's rise, and all of you have heard about China. China has a very strong emerging relationship even with Russia. It is trying to push forth the Belt and Road Initiative as a development platform and trying to coax the European powers to join the Belt and Road Initiative. In Asia, we are not so sanguine about accepting China's, altruistic, so-called altruistic ambitions or strong points. And China and relations between China and Japan are tense because of disputes in the South and East China Seas. Concerns are very high over a nuclearized North Korea and the long-standing impasse in the Korean peninsula, which has continued. There is a slight thaw. We are hopeful that North and South Korea will talk. The US is going to engage with North Korea. But given the past history of North Korea to back off from any agreements it arrives at, we really do not know the future of this dialogue, which is slated for next month. So the world, therefore, will continue to need an America that is economically vital, socially appealing, responsibly powerful, strategically deliberate, and internationally respected, and historically enlightened in its global engagements in the Eastern world. Another possibility is that what we are going to witness is the rise of a multiple of powers, such as China, India, and Brazil, who grow strong enough to share the stage with the United States, even if they do not necessarily match the United States, but they become an important component in any US power play. It is therefore likely that we will witness the rise of a new power system that would be less global and more regional. So you will have the evolution or the evolving regional hubs, which will play a very important role in moving global geopolitics. Such a region-based international order, some feel, could be damaging because it could spell the end of the global norms in both economic and security realms. But I do not think that this is going to happen, because the regional powers would need to look not only at each other, but also to the US to play the role of a balancer. And that becomes very important as Russia and China together try to challenge the democratically rules-based order in the international domain. So a survey of emerging strategic dynamics in East Asia therefore points to a power-sharing approach in global realm. So there's going to be a give and take. There is going to be a give and take, and the new dynamics which will emerge, if they're allowed to emerge, is what we all need to focus on. A significant contemporary element of the changing global power relations is the emergence of geopolitical and geoeconomic groupings. Organizations such as the G7 or the G8 are not reflective of a majority of global population, and therefore they cannot decide for everyone as they have done in the past. They no longer represent fully the current system of power because of the rise of Asia. There is a complex web of bilateral and plurilateral relationships which is emerging in Asia, and organizations of varying effectiveness and legitimacy which are emerging as an important dynamic variable in the global order. Some of them, such as the East Asia Summit, have been built especially since the Asian financial crisis of 1997-98. Then you have the ASEAN. It is a grouping of about 13 East Asian countries. China, they're not totally united in every aspect of their relationship. China continues to divide the ASEAN countries amongst one another, but slowly the realization is dawning that ASEAN needs to get its house in order to take on the China challenge. Another important grouping here is the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, or the SCO. India and Pakistan have recently, on Russian insistence and Russian support, have become members of the SCO. And when you speak with Russian interlocutors, they say that is to bring about stability in South Asia and to bring about some kind of an amicable resolution between India, China, and Pakistan in South Asia. To which India does not agree to each and every aspect of that reasoning. But in the meanwhile, plurilateral gatherings such as the China-Japan-South Korea trilateral or the US-Japan-India trilateral have emerged as strong variables and a strong response to economic and strategic forces in East Asia. Some of them span the Pacific, and most notably the Asia-Pacific Economic Forum. While the members of the others, the Asia-Pacific has more recently been given the nomenclature of Indo-Pacific, which testifies to the growing importance the United States places on India to play a more leading role in the emerging Asian dynamics. So, like post-Cold War, Asia has seen momentous changes. This has also greatly impacted Chinese foreign policy and its relations with major powers in East Asia. China has achieved spectacular economic success over the past 2 decades. It has consistently sustained high economic growth rates, which in turn has greatly increased China's influence in regional and global affairs, fueling an intense geostrategic competition in East Asia. Along with China's rise has been the rise of Japan, which at one time seemed to be in decline, but under Shinzo Abe, Japanese reassertion and trying to regain its lost space is something which we witness today. I was in Tokyo a month ago, and you find a very resurgent and confident Tokyo ready to assume its place in the global pecking order. Similar is the case with India, which has made its Act East policy, or its Look East policy has been converted into an Act East policy. And we find that Prime Minister Modi has made about 4 visits to East Asia, to the quadrilateral, to the East Asian, to various multilateral and bilateral, from various multilateral and bilateral meetings. Therefore, converting Look East into Act East and trying to forge a solidarity amongst the East Asian countries. Interestingly, we celebrate our Republic Day on the 26th of January, where we invite one head of state as the chief guest. This could be, anyone who India feels is important at that moment. It could be the Chinese premier, the Russian president, the American president, the French, so we but this time, in a departure from protocol and the established norm, we invited the 10 ASEAN leaders. So all 10 heads of states collectively were provided a platform to meet one another bilaterally, as well as there were a number of multilateral engagements. And this is something which has been noticed globally, not just in Asia or in India, but the American media has covered this aspect of Indian diplomacy very widely. While China emerges as a major player or has emerged as a major player in Asia, what I think sitting in the West, a lot of us overlook is Russia's own look east policy. Russia itself is getting increasingly engaged in Asia, especially the Russia-China alliance or the Russia-China relationship is a direct offshoot or a dynamic of US-Russia relations. US-Russia relations, which reached the lowest ebb in 2014 following Russian annexation of Crimea and its attack on Ukraine, shows no major signs of improvement. With the coming of Trump, it was felt that, since Trump had made all the right noises as candidate Trump in 2016, that he wanted to do a reset with Russia. But I think the very fact, this whole inquiry into the Russian role in US elections has put the pressure on Trump. And what you witness is that relations have not improved. In the summer of 2017, in fact, tensions once again flared up over Moscow's pulling out of a de-confliction agreement with Washington over Syria, and Russia prepared counter-sanctions against the US. As a result, what we witnessed is the sanction war between US and Russia has got escalated, and Russia has come under renewed Western sanctions because of its role and because of the fact it is not coming to the negotiating table over Ukraine, and because of the role it is playing in Syria. In June 2017, the EU voted to extend its sanctions on Russia. These were further extended in January of this year. And the FBI continues to investigate Kremlin's meddling in the 2016 US elections. And what Moscow did was counter by ordering a reduction of US diplomatic staff in Moscow and seizing of US diplomatic compounds in Russia, which invited retaliation from the United States. So whatever signs of a rapprochement were there between the two Cold War adversaries continue to be, US-Russia relations continue to be unpredictable. And what we find is Russian disregard for NATO, and Russia says that it is not going to accept any NATO expansion or aggressive designs of the West under US leadership. So there is no reset 2.0 or a grand bargain which one was hoping for. But I think Russia has lost the kind of strategic space it had gained with its first attack on Syria. Russia seems to have lost this space right now, and the element of surprise is not happening in either. So what are the prospects now for US-Russia relations? Because this becomes a very important component in resetting global norms, and also especially in East Asia, and more specifically for India. I'll come to that in the second part of my presentation. In a testimony to the US Senate Committee on Countering Russia, further assessing options for sanctions last year, former US Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs Nicholas Burns labeled Russia the most dangerous, I quote this, the most dangerous US adversary in the world today. He further testified that for more than a decade, Russian President Vladimir Putin has used the power of the Russian state to undermine American interests in Europe, the Middle East, and now in the heart of a democratic system here in the US. So Donald Trump is faced with a very difficult dilemma. He personally would probably want to mend relations, and I think this is what the two leaders, the Russian leader and the US president, need to sit down and bury the hatchet and move things forward. And there was some kind of rapprochement in July 2017 on the sidelines of the G20 summit in Hamburg, where a meeting scheduled initially for half an hour went on for over an hour and a half. But after that rapprochement in the summer of 2017, we've had a very cold, frosty winter at the beginning of 2018. And I think what has happened is the US, China, Russia, and what they are doing in Asia Pacific is what emerges as an important dynamic. China's assertiveness, China's rise, China's militarization, its challenging of the global order continues unabated, though it seeks to allay fears of regional countries by organizing the APEC agenda and trying to show that its rise is peaceful. But since 2011, what we've witnessed in the Asia-Pacific, or now called the Indo-Pacific, is greater US engagement. It started off in November 2011 when President Obama came forward with the US rebalance of the US pivot strategy. This followed Hillary Clinton's article published in the Foreign Policy Journal entitled America's Pacific Century. So America realized the importance of the Pacific. It realized the importance, and she wrote in that article, harnessing Asia's growth and dynamism is central to American economic and strategic interests and a key priority for US policy. Open markets in Asia provide the US with unprecedented opportunities for investment, trade, and access to cutting-edge technology. Our economic recovery at home will depend on exports and the ability of American firms to tap into the vast and growing consumer base of Asia. Strategically maintaining peace and security across the Asia-Pacific is increasingly crucial to global progress, whether through defining freedom of navigation in the South China Sea, countering the proliferation efforts of North Korea, or ensuring transparency in the military activities of the region's key players. So this reaffirmation of US policy has made Asia emerge as one of the hubs, one of the important players in global interactions, in any global setting. So the US continues under Trump to remain engaged in the region, setting at rest all speculation about US decline and US reluctance to remain engaged in Asia. The US has too much at stake in Asia to cede space over here, as I mentioned, to China, and the US continues to refer to India as the linchpin of its East Asia strategy. It is seen as what the US would like to do with India is seen as a concert of democracies. Two democratic countries wanting to establish a rules-based order to challenge what China wants to do in Asia Pacific. India was not a priority country for Trump when he assumed office, but over a period of time we've seen that Trump has focused on India, and India continues and India has regained its position as one of the foremost countries with which the United States wants to do work. The expanding US-India defense trade is one such manifestation of the growing US-India partnership. This has caused a great deal of concern in Russia because traditionally India was the Soviet Union's biggest client or customer for Soviet defense equipment. We still are based on the Soviet-era defense equipment, but increasingly we're turning and looking westwards. Our Prime Minister, the Indian Prime Minister, was here in Sweden. He was in Stockholm exactly a week ago, signing a number of strategic defense deals for smart cities and things like that. So India is not only looking, we are a nation power, but we are also increasingly trying to do more because we need the technology to help us catapult from a developing economy and make that change as a developed player in the global order. So this is how there is a dynamic in the Asia-Pacific, US, India, China. And what I just alluded to, the frosty US-Russia relations has led Russia to look increasingly to China, and China has emerged as one of the biggest investors in Russia. China needs Russian energy, Russian crude, and in return, I think it is helping Russia to integrate with the Central Asian republics, help it build infrastructure by way of energy pipelines into Central Asia and also into China. So this is much needed economic bolstering of the Russian economy, which the Chinese are facilitating. But this could have long-term strategic implications. And the way we look at it objectively from India, there is not much real trust between Russia and China. Russia, I think, is, I would like to hear more from you, is not very comfortable about growing Chinese influence and presence, especially in Siberia, and would like to balance its relationships with the other Asian powers. And this could be the reason, is the reason why Russia is once again trying to re-engage with India, renew the old historical relationship with India. We have an annual meeting between the two leaders, which has been going on for the last 17 years, since 2000. We have an annual strategic dialogue between President Putin and the Indian Prime Minister. And the last one was in St. Petersburg in June of 2017, and I think this one, this year, it's going to be held in India. So one is that, and secondly, India is also trying to help Russia build bridges with Vietnam. Russia and Vietnam, Russia and Japan, have been doing a lot of work together, and Putin wants to integrate himself further into the East Asian architecture in Asia. Russia also seems to be becoming aware that the US needs Russia for establishing global norms. The US needs Russia for Syria, to diffuse the situation in Syria. And what we've seen is that there seems to be some kind of a tacit understanding between Russia and the US to though there are times when it becomes a very fractious engagement over Syria. But on the whole, both want some kind of restoration of order in Syria. They might not agree on the kind of government or who should continue to remain in Syria. Also, when it comes to global challenges like climate change, terrorism, the global war on terror, I think these are common issues where the two countries have continued to engage with one another and speak to one another. So what we are witnessing today is some kind of a balancing of relationships, balancing of priorities, where all of us are talking to one another at one level, while at the same time trying to maintain strategic independence and the right to strategic autonomy in action. If you want any more details, I would be happy to share those details. Russia and China, I'll get back to this. The two countries also have been engaged militarily. And why I'm talking so much about Russia and China is because what I'm going to focus on, its implications for India and its concerns in India. That becomes a very important dynamic in what Russia and China are doing. In 2016 September, Russia and China held their first ever, they held a maritime exercise, sustained military exercises. And as a result of Russia-China engagement, for the first time ever, Russia held military exercises with Pakistan. And Pakistan is one country where India has been locked in a bitter debate and in a bitter, like Pakistan has been bleeding India. It's been the policy of their former Prime Minister Bhutto to bleed India through 1,000 cuts. And Kashmir continues to be fought over between, it's a dispute between India and Pakistan, and this dispute is in the United Nations. So China uses cross-border terrorism and Pakistan as an instrument of its policy to keep India confined to South Asia and to therefore curb Indian aspirations for a global or a bigger role. And this is what causes a great deal of concern in India, because what we see is that Putin's vision of Russia's integration into greater Europe has not happened, and this seems to be getting replaced by a greater Asia with the goal of building an economic corridor from Shanghai to St. Petersburg. While Russia and China, along with India, have been a part of the regional Russia-India-China grouping, the new strengthened Russia and China bonhomie seems to signal greater competition with the US and hence poses a challenge for Indian foreign policy. Russia has started supplying defense equipment to China, and this causes further challenges to Indian policy. And in this emerging new dynamic, India looks at Asian geopolitics to safeguard its economic and security interests. India and Japan have realized that they cannot ensure peace in the Indo-Pacific as they lack the military means as well as the political capacity. You know, the two big Asian economies are India and Japan, both democracies, wanting to take on the China challenge, but they do realize that without US support, they would not be able to take on the China challenge. Russia does not threaten us militarily at all, neither on our land borders, neither in the Pacific. But China is the real threat, and therefore we seek greater US role and engagement in the Indo-Pacific, as does Europe, wanting to strengthen the transatlantic relationship with the United States because of the Russia challenge. So while Europe faces a greater Russia challenge, Asia faces a greater China challenge, and I think both Europe and Asia would want the US to continue to play this role of a balancer in international relations for some more time to come. And that is what brings me to Indian policy. What does India really hope? As China becomes more powerful in the region, India, there's a realization and there's a debate in India that we need to snap out of our old ways of thinking and find new ways of strengthening ourselves. We are in a dilemma as we seek to manage our relations with China and the United States, at the same time maintaining our long-cherished foreign policy doctrine of strategic autonomy. There is a history to strategic autonomy, and this goes back to the Cold War years. 1945, when the Second World War entered, and you found the world in two power blocks, Russia, one led by the Soviet Union and one by the United States. Soon after, in 1947, India became independent from Great Britain, and while the US, which had supported the Indian war effort, Indian independence effort because it needed Indian support during the war. India was a major base of operations for the Allied efforts against Japan at that time. But India wanted to retain its autonomy and came up with what is called the non-aligned movement, that we would align politically and strategically and militarily neither with the United States nor with the Soviet Union. So India became the champion of the non-aligned movement with some of the other colonial powers which had got independence from Great Britain. But unfortunately, non-alignment was not very successful. These countries were very poor, economically backward, did not have any industry. There were huge developmental challenges, and soon we became dependent in some kind of a debt trap, and we were always borrowing money from the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. But otherwise, we looked towards the socialist experiment, the USSR, and modeled our economic development along the Soviet-era 5-year platform. This continued till 1971. India trying to balance its interests. 1962 was the worst foreign policy challenge which India faced when China inflicted a humiliating defeat on our northern border. They came into Indian territory and occupied a lot of Indian territory. But 1971, China and the United States, I mean, those of you who are students of international relations would know about Kissinger diplomacy. And they did China and the United States, they mended bridges and became friends, therefore tilting the balance of power against the Soviet Union globally. This is the time when the USSR signed the 20 years Treaty of Peace and Friendship with India, and something which India needed and was grateful for this offer, and hence became a very strong period of this alignment, US-China versus India and Russia. So India's aspirations to be a global player are nothing very new. Even when we did not have the economic clout, we wanted to peg ourselves way above our weight and be noticed in international affairs. And that is the year when we also made our first and foremost strategic move by dismembering Pakistan and by creating Bangladesh out of East Pakistan, where a civil war was raging. And we got rid of this constant threat on our eastern borders of Pakistan. So I think this was something which made the world sit up and take notice of India. But I think, and this is also the era of very strong Soviet-India friendship and military alliance. It was more like a very strong economic and strategic alliance. I would not call it a formal alliance in a military sense of a word, but India continued to retain its strategic autonomy. Now, this concept of strategic autonomy meant being non-aligned during the Cold War, but now India feels, or being equidistant between the US and China. So in its new avatar, strategic autonomy for India means, when we are asked, are you going to become a US ally or a treaty partner? No. We want to remain equidistant between China and the United States. But these old interpretations of strategic autonomy are increasingly untenable for India's national interests, because India faces stiff security competition from China, which continues to modernize its military and challenge India on its borders, India's maritime frontiers. It is establishing bases in the Indian Ocean, which become a direct threat and a challenge to us. So this challenge from China is what has prompted us very cautiously to deepen our engagement with the United States in a perfectly rational move to safeguard our interests. But skeptics of this engagement, both abroad and within India, there are skeptics to our engagement, growing engagement with the United States within the country, feel that India is going to be robbed of its foreign policy independence and its choices. But India has managed to find a fine balance, though it's never a perfect balance. There are times when the balance gets upset. But India's necessary policy evolution seems to have reached something of a milestone in 2017. We became very confident, and it took 3 major foreign policy actions when it comes to India that demonstrated a way to protect its interests in security competition with China, while also deflecting charges of undue alignment with the US. First of all, in May of 2017, Xi Jinping, the Chinese premier, convened the Belt and Road Forum initiative in Beijing. India, despite pressure from China, did not participate in the BRI forum in May in Beijing. Second, in the summer of 2017, India and China were involved in a long major standoff over the Doklam Plateau, which is a disputed territory between Bhutan and China. And Bhutan being an Indian protectorate, India felt militarily and morally responsible to send its troops to defend Bhutan from being overrun by China. And thirdly, in November, India shed off its inhibitions on the sidelines of the East Asian Forum in Manila in November 2017. India, Japan, Australia, and the United States came together once again to have an official quadrilateral dialogue. Now, the quadrilateral dialogue was first mooted by Prime Minister Abe when he was the Prime Minister of Japan in 2007, very briefly, to be an alternative mechanism to challenge Chinese assertiveness. But because of Chinese pressure, especially on Australia, the Australian Prime Minister at that time, Kevin Rudd, the strong China-Australia economic linkages, which are still continuing to this day, Australia withdrew from the quadrilateral alliance, but India, Japan, and the United States continued to strengthen various trilateral and bilateral mechanisms, maritime, economic, and also by way of military exercises, in trying to send certain messages to China as to, it would need to contend with a joint maritime mechanism if they try to challenge the international order. So the underlying common thread running through these policies is the accelerating security competition with China. It is also a response to China's relatively more recent revisionist approach to regional security, especially its attempts to forcibly claim and consolidate territorial entities on India's border. The Quad has therefore turned out to be one of India's ambitious order-preserving actions in recent years. It is a loose security commitment of a community. There is no, there is no physical body as such, and there is no parliament or anything. Nobody knows what the next step in the Quad is going to be. But there is a great deal, because China expressed concern and tried to put pressure that India and Japan, especially on India and Japan, to withdraw from the Quad. It is still continuing with its efforts with Australia, but New Delhi's decision to join the club suggests a new level of commitment to defend the existing liberal order. Beyond the US and China, India is firmly committed to defending the liberal world order. It does not mean that it would blindly support US power or policies. We have major differences on some key international issues, especially on Iran. We do not agree with the US policy on Iran because Iran is something where India has very big strategic concerns. Also, India's economic engagement in the face of, as a result of US withdrawal from the Trans-Pacific Partnership in, how many of you have heard of the TPP, which the US was negotiating with 12 other countries, and the US under Trump has withdrawn from the Trans-Pacific Partnership. So Japan has assumed the lead and has actually invited India to take the place of US in TPP, though more recently, Trump has once again signaled US. You see, I think he's a very unpredictable person. And India, like any other country, needs to deal with the unpredictability of the Trump administration. Today, we may be very high on his priority, but we are not sure that if we would be able to sustain or maintain this relationship, because when it comes to trade, the US has a trade deficit with India, not a very major deficit, it's just about $30 billion. But this is something which Trump mentions repeatedly. But I think as long as we continue to buy, the checks keep going into the US Treasury, and India continues to buy defense hardware from the United States, we are comfortable, and we are in need of massive modernization of our defense industry. Not defense industry, of our military hardware, especially our Air Force faces acute shortages. And I think one of the reasons why our Prime Minister was given a red carpet welcome in Sweden was India's in the market for multi-medium range fighter jets. There's an acute shortage in the Indian Air Force for the fighter jets, and the two strong contenders are the Euro Consortium, that is the Saab group led by Sweden, and the American Lockheed Martin, who are trying to sell us the F-16s. So the bidding for this is underway, and I think both sides, both countries, the Europeans and the Americans, are lobbying very hard to get a foothold in the Indian market and bag this major order, which would take care of a lot of the economies. So there exists, therefore, a healthy mechanism. And for India, you see, in this balancing power, why we are not worried that India would succumb is because of the very nature of a democracy. The rule of law, the different minorities, the different regional interests within India ensure that there is always a healthy debate, not only pertaining to domestic policies, but also as far as our foreign policy choices are concerned. I remember in 2007, our government nearly fell for having signed the nuclear deal with the United States, because it was a coalition government and the coalition partners did not support this becoming too close to the American system, the American establishment. And there was a trust vote in Parliament, and the government nearly was voted out of power. Fortunately, in India, we have a very strong government right now. It is a majority government, but it is getting challenged politically due to certain domestic, this is one of the interesting things about Indian democracy, that there's always a churn. We are still a work in progress. We are a very chaotic, noisy country. We shout a lot, we scream a lot. You've traveled a lot in India, and you will see that regional parties are emerging as very strong contributors to the national polity. And indications are that this present government might not be able to retain its preeminent position, and it might need to go in for a coalition government. And that in itself makes it necessary for any government at the center to take India's diversity and cultural plurality and political plurality along when coming to any decision of national importance.